of a chat here, and then we're going to hand it over to our amazing MC, and she'll get us going from there. So I'm going to jump in and say that the genesis of this was some conversations I've had with Mohammed over the past little while. And I've been here at the museum for 17 years, but right now we have this really powerful exhibit. It's called Refuge Canada, and it's traveling around the country. And right now it's actually in Kingston, Ontario at the Pump House Museum. Cette exposition contient beaucoup de points intéressants. Elle encourage le public à suivre les traces des demandeurs d'asile. L'une de mes parties préférées de l'exposition, c'est la section qui présente des bulles de vérité. Il s'agit d'une série de déclarations communément évoquées, combinées aux faits concrets qui s'y rapportent. Par exemple, les réfugiés sont une faldue pour le système, ce qui est catégoriquement faux. Another really interesting area for me has been the media wall in it. And what it does is there's all sorts of clippings, old school articles, editorial cartoons, even some social media posts that portray refugees and immigrants. And some of them are good, but a lot of them are not good. And the interesting thing is some of them are from generations ago, like late 19th century. And so Canadians have been criticizing immigrants for a long time, like since before Confederation, in fact. So sometimes the lawmakers, the policymakers echoed that racism in their policies, and other times they strove to eliminate the racism from the policies, especially some of the policies of more recent time. So I've really, for me, the hair on the back of my neck stands up when I hear somebody say things like, oh, these immigrants, they're taking our jobs, or, things like that. And at the same time, I know that this has been happening since people arrived, not long after people arrived on these shores. So when we started talking about doing this work together, Mohammed and I was really keen to start with something that unpacked some of those thoughts about immigration policy, and the racism inherent in some of those conversations or not. So what better way than to have a whole lot of really smart people share their knowledge and life experience with us. So that's what we hope to do this afternoon. And now, speaking of smart people, I want to hand the mic over to my colleague and friend, Mohammed Hashim. And every time I have to say that I talk to Mohammed, I learn things. I also have a belly laugh. And I think it's an amazing way to learn, is to do both at the same time. I think when you laugh, you open your heart and your mind to more. And so Mohammed, over to you, my friend. And I'm grateful to be here with you today.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you. Thank you very much. So once again, my name is Mohammed Hashim. I'm at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And thank you all for coming today. I want to begin by acknowledging the land in which I come from, and which is the city of Mississauga, and which is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land. In particular, I want to acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Ojibwe-Chippewa peoples, and the land the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the First Credit Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to work here, and by doing so, give my deepest respect to its first inhabitants. I want to start off just by thanking Rebecca and Kimberly Bennett, the communications director at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, who really are the ones who put this all together. So thank you so much for doing everything that you've done. And also, this is the first collaboration that I've been able to do with another Crown corporation from that's under the Canadian Heritage Department. And as sister organizations, I thought it'd be good for me just to acknowledge a few people that are in the audience that are part of our Crown Corporation of Canadian Heritage World. So and also board of directors from the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. So I want to acknowledge Roy Pogorzelski and Alicia Danley from the board of directors of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, Charles Slowey and Colin Boyd from Canadian Heritage, Christina Tessier, who's the CEO of Ingenium. If you ever want to inspire your kids to become astronauts, they have a Canada arm there. So go check out that museum. Clint Curl from the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, Fatima Hassan from the Anti-Racism Secretariat at Canadian Heritage, and Angela Casey from the National Gallery of Canada. And thank you all for coming today. This is the first of, I hope, many conversations. I want to frame the conversation a little bit. A friend of mine once told me there's 3 golden rules to being Canadian. You have to say please, you have to say thank you, and you have to stand in line. The moment I heard that, it kind of made total sense to me. As Canadians, I think we kind of like standing in line. It tells us that there's a bit of fairness in the world, and that our turn will eventually come, and that there is an order to how we get things and get things done. The idea of having to patiently wait your turn is one that I believe really is a true Canadian value. Patiently waiting your turn. So when we hear the terms illegal immigrant, many of us, including myself, I get my back goes up, because the term illegal immigrant means that they probably jumped the queue. How dare they? Is that term fair? Like, Canada has we have a very robust immigration system. We rely on immigration for population, economic growth. We have rules. We have a proper immigration system. People come here as immigrants, as refugee claimants, as students, as visitors visas, and we have rules and regulations set up for those who break the rules. So who are these illegal immigrants? Even those who are crossing on irregular border crossings are being processed. And there's a mechanism to deal with that. So who are the illegal immigrants? And when we look at the images of who is showing up when people talk about illegal immigrants, they typically look like non-white faces, most recently at least. So first, it's illegal immigrants. Then we hear conversations about them taking up housing, or then they're ruining a neighborhood. Then they're bringing in sickness in some places. And in Mississauga, where I live, the biggest complaint we hear is that they're taking up all the local parking spots, on and on. So when we think about criticizing immigration, I know for many, people get their backs up, like almost preparing to hear the racist trope that follows, which leads me to think, are people criticizing the policy, or are they criticizing the people? And that's what we really want to find out. So today we thought we'd delve into that question and invite some of the most brilliant minds that I know to think about this and to kickstart this conversation. And I'll let Marie give a quick introduction of Hannah, and we'll be on our way. Thank you for coming out today, everybody.
Thanks, Mohammed. Okay, Hannah Sung. So I have this official paragraph I'm going to read, and I'm going to tell you something else. Hannah Sung has been involved with the Canadian media industry since 1999, working variously as a writer, reporter, producer, podcaster, public speaker, and consultant. She's been heavily involved in the producing of podcasts for the Globe and Mail, including a recent move into branded content. And she was appointed as the Asper Fellow of the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western in 2020. So a lot of people, and we just talked about this earlier, Hannah and I, there's a very specific cohort of people that see Hannah and remember their youth and her being a VJ. I'm not one of those. I am too old, and I was really boring, and that was not part of my world. But I am fangirling because the podcast series that you hosted, Hannah, with Denise Balkasoon, called Color Code, was amazing to me. It was one of my first podcasts that I listened to, and again, it was 2016, 5 years ago. It was also before an election in the States that changed an awful lot of stuff. And I went back, I was just saying, I revisited that set of podcasts, and I've been listening to them again. And in so many ways, they've aged well, which is sort of sad because things just are not changing very fast. And so one of the things I loved about those podcasts, Hannah, and I think you'll see this today, everybody else, is your agility and your ability to have these conversations and weave the different perspectives together. And so to have somebody like you convening this panel and moderating this panel, to me, is amazing. And it's such an honor to say thank you to you and to hand it over to you to be the woman who ties it all together for us. So everybody, welcome Hannah Sung.
Thank you so much, Marie. I hope you haven't oversold me. My gosh, I already have a pop-up up that I don't know how to deal with. Okay, here we go. Thanks for mentioning that podcast that we made at the Globe, because it was my first experience of speaking publicly about race. And I have to say that doing that can be scary, I think, for very obvious reasons. So I'm very grateful to everybody here on this panel today. I'm also really grateful to the people who have come here as audience, because life is just wild right now. Everything's changing all the time. And for you to take a moment to really look at the big picture of thinking and talking about race and immigration is something that I think is very special, because what I hope is that after our conversation today, there can be a spin-off effect in which you can feel emboldened to have these conversations with the people who are close to you in your own life. All right, dealing with this pop-up. I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists. We have Dr. Rohini Banerjee, who is a professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax. There you are. Hi, Rohini, welcome. We have Carrie Newman, the ordained professor of visual arts in Victoria at UVic. Hi, Carrie, and welcome. We have Liban Abukor, who is executive director of Youth Leaps, which connects young racialized people with employment opportunities. And you are also in Toronto, like me. Hi. I would like to start by getting everyone to kind of give us a brief professional background so we can get to know you and your work. And I was hoping you could tell us about your work and how it informs your view of today's question about immigration and race. Why don't we start with you, Rohini?
Sure. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Mohammed, Marie, and everyone involved in making this happen. So I'm like Marie, I'm in Shabuktatuk in Mi'kmaq territory. It's a beautiful day here in Halifax. I have a really amazing job, I think. I'm at St. Mary's, where I, during the day, if not in front of a Zoom class, teaching literature of the Francophone world, in particular of the Indian Ocean. So I work on Mauritius and all of the diaspora that is of that region. So I read a lot, I get to talk a lot, I get to analyze a lot, but I also get to interact with students. And so my professional sort of day job might be teaching and reading and writing, but I'm also a graduate coordinator for international development studies, which means I get to interact with students from outside of Canada who want to come and do a master's or PhD in IDS. I also work with students in women and gender studies and Asian studies and peace and conflict studies. So I have my fingers in a few different places, but with that comes a plurality of identity and experience that I get to have the privilege of observing. And my work as union president for the faculty as well allows me to meet professors who decide to make Canada their home and who are also immigrants and also want to contribute to academia. So part of my work is to work on equity and diversity and inclusion at the professorate level as well. And I'm a kid of immigrants. So I was born and raised in Dartmouth. Parents from Himachal Pradesh in northern India came to PEI in 1968 and never left the Maritimes. And now I'm a mom of 3 boys, and I'm fascinated on how they look at immigration and their role as a new version of settler, and how they acknowledge and work on the territory of Mi'kmaq. So I hope to learn from all of you and add some flavor to the discussion. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rohini. Can we go to you, Carrie, and at UVic, tell us about your work as an artist and how it informs your view of race and immigration.
Yeah, I'll start with my traditional introduction. Yo, Nugwam Carrie Newman, Heyman Bakum Kla'i, Hayalth Kingume. Through my father, I'm Kwakwaka'wakw from the Kwekwekum, Giksam, and Wallabai clans of northern Vancouver Island, and Coast Salish from Chiam of the Stalo Nation along the Upper Fraser Valley. Through my mother, my ancestors are settlers of English, Irish, and Scottish heritage. And I'm coming, as you said, Hannah, from Victoria at UVic, which are on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples I want to say Gala Kasla to the Canadian Museum of Immigration and everybody there for this invitation. Thank you, Hannah, for moderating this, and say what an honor it is for me to be here with all these other panelists. My artistic practice has evolved over time, but currently it's about addressing social issues that relate to reconciliation. I made an artwork called the Witness Blanket, which resides at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg. And I started working on that in 2012. And that really drew me into thinking about and understanding what terms like reconciliation and decolonization mean. And sort of started me on a path of understanding how artwork can interact with these different questions, and it really sort of centered my thoughts around land and around these conversations. I mean, I am a complicated version of a Canadian citizen. I identify as Kwakwaka'wakw for my nationhood, but I have English, Irish, Scottish ancestors who came here. The history of my family means that, you know, one side of my family came here to benefit from the same things that harmed the other side of my family. And so when I think about immigration and go back through time to the early colonization and how that persists through today, that's what I think about when I think about this question, right? How does it relate to land? How does it affect Indigenous people? And just one more thing that drives my interest here is that my wife is immigrated here from Taiwan when she was 3 years old. And so it gives me, like, having these conversations with her gives me the perspective of what it's like for someone to come here and come through our school systems and not know about these issues, not learn in the school system at that time, which is pretty recently, about residential schools, for instance, about the policies around clearing the plains. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm going to stop there and say thank you, and Carrie, thank you.
Yeah. Well, definitely, we're going to dig into all of that for sure. And just before I kick it over to Liban, I want to mention to everybody who is here that if you prefer to hear this conversation in French, I actually don't know if you'll be hearing it or if you'll be reading it, but there are instructions for you in the chat, because there is some instantaneous translation happening. I don't even know the mechanics of that, but it's there for you to use if you like. And Liban, here in Toronto, I'm going to ask you about your work and how it informs your view of this question of race and immigration.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. It's wonderful to join this incredible panel here today. First and foremost, happy Friday, everyone. In Toronto, it is beautiful, the weather where we are. So I just wanted to just sort of remark on that. So my name is Liban Abukor. I am an immigrant to this country. I arrived here when I was 4 or 5 years old, from Somalia as a consequence of the decolonization project that was happening in my country, and the conflict that occurred as a result of the liberation movements. In my last 10 or 15 years, my work is really focused on working with Black and otherwise racialized groups, many of them either first generation Canadians or immigrants themselves, and thinking about how we could provide or ensure they have access to meaningful employment and workforce development opportunities. And right now, the particular demographic I work with is young people or youth, which are between the ages of 14 to 29 years old. And the working with them requires us to address many, 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 many gaps or issues with their settlement experience, which may inhibit or constrain their capacity or ability to access meaningful employment opportunities that provide income and opportunity for self-actualization of skills goals, as well as their own agency. So that's where I come to this work. I'm mindful about how immigration policy and immigration experience impacts their own ability to fully, as I mentioned earlier, encapsulate their own agency and recognize their own capacity. So I'm looking forward to the discussion ahead to talk about where the opportunities lie in improving the experience, whether settlement or the immigration experience from their home to here, as well as what it means when we critique race in a racist manner, the consequences of racist approaches to immigration. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you know, Liban, I want to stick with you for a moment for the next question, because I basically just want to tackle the question that is the theme of this entire talk, you know, is criticizing immigration racist? But specifically, you're in it, helping young people connect with work. And of course, so much of immigration policy, I'm not the expert, but it really seems like it's founded in the economic and labor needs of the country. So labor and immigration are so linked. And so I'm just going to start with you and put the question to you. Is it racist to criticize immigration policy?
I mean, I think it's important to contextualize things, right? I mean, for the first 100 years of this country's official existence, our immigration policy was pretty explicit. We were only allowing immigrants from, you know, white European nations, right? That was effectively it. And in the 1960s, we see a change in our immigration policy that begins to allow immigrants from non-European nations, right? So that's where you see this largely white population here in Canada begin to really start interacting with more recent immigrants who are racialized. And so while the conversation is they're taking our jobs, the other real conversation is they're not assimilating. They threaten the whiteness of this nation, the culture, the fabric, etc. And so I think it's important to recognize sort of where the conventional arguments of you're taking our jobs is really just cover for that more, you're changing the very whiteness of our nation, right? And so I certainly, I think the approach or the arguments against, you know, immigration policies that are becoming more and more, if you will, liberalized, it can be racist, but more important than that, they can be incredibly harmful, right? And so one of the things that is a consequence of having immigration policies that sort of respond to the xenophobic attitudes is that it really leaves millions and millions and millions of people in vulnerable positions around this world susceptible to incredibly harmful positions, right? So I'll use my family example as one. In Somalia till today, there's a steady stream of individuals seeking opportunity in other nations, whether they're leaving, whether it's environmental degradation, whether it's war, famine, what have you. And because it's really difficult to immigrate from Somalia to a place like the US or to Canada, we often have to find a middle route to get here, right? So we're going through, whether it's, death-defying feats of trying to, cross the Red Sea into Yemen or go through Libya to get into Europe. And so there's a Somali poet called Wesson Shiro who says, it's a tragedy when that a boat is safer than the land you were born on, right? It kind of opens up your eyes to this idea that how difficult it is to try to find safe homes when those places that we're all just, many of us are attempting to arrive at, see us as threats or unwanted in those lands, right? And the consequences of that, as I just mentioned, are not only trying to find, unconventional alternative routes, but what that exposes us to, which is human trafficking, right? Many, many, many women are now victims of that as a result of going through these unconventional routes to places like Canada. I recognize that sort of that's really expansive in sort of what we're talking about, but I really just wanted to quickly talk about not only is it racist, but really just quickly point out what the consequences of that racism are. And I'm happy to sort of get back to, as in the course of the discussion, that our immigration policies are not about altruism. They are an economic exchange, right? The benefits of immigration in this country are overwhelmingly in favor of the host nation instead of just the immigrant who finds homes here. And so we can get to that in sort of in the subsequent conversations, but I'll stop there.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I would love to talk about, the effects of racist immigration policies or policies that have unintended ill effects for sure. But I love that you were basically getting at what lens we are using when we think about critiquing immigration policy. Are we coming to it from a white supremacist perspective, which was the perspective of the past, or are we coming to it from a different, say, pluralistic, say, more modern perspective? I also just want to say that it doesn't have to be me always who's passing the torch, but Zoom can be so awkward. So I want either Carrie or Rohini to just jump in here and to tell us your perspective on, do you feel comfortable critiquing immigration policy publicly, for example? Who wants to go next?
Well, I can go in and, I know when I had a little moment of panic when I saw the question being proposed. I'm a debater from high school, from junior high school. Be it resolved that. So I started thinking of all the argumentation and, putting my points together. And really, I feel that one of the impacts of not having open dialogue and discussion is we sit in denial. So we know that when some system denies racism, that in itself is being racist. And as, at least in academia, as we start to pull away at structural racism, we are starting to no longer deny what exists. And so by posing the question, it is an anti-racist act, is what I feel it is. I feel that one of the questions that I have, at least, and please, I ask the panelists to join me in this conversation. Who decides? How do we choose? And we can blame a system, we can blame a government who's in power at the time, but there are individuals who look at dossiers and files. There are individuals who are interacting with new Canadians, or new to be new Canadians. There's an actual need for intercultural competence. And I'm very curious to know who is being hired for these positions. How are we informing the system in which they are working? How are we ensuring that as they look at a dossier and look at a file, remain as equitable in their approach? And as we all know, as human beings, no matter what workplace we're in, we have implicit bias. And how are we addressing that? So that's kind of the question I have lots of other things popping through my head right now, but I feel by asking the question, we are fundamentally becoming anti-racist. We're actually pulling away at some of the underlying denial of the existence of it, with the assumptions that the system works, we vet files, we vet people, and we let only who we think will be productive citizens of our country. And I think by asking the question, we're making a great statement.
I find that very empowering, Rohini, because when we talk about racism and we talk about systemic barriers, it can feel very heavy. And I love the idea that by posing questions and having conversations, that they are active anti-racist acts. Carrie, did you have anything that you wanted to project?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been thinking about this on a couple of different levels. We have if you're criticizing criticizing immigration, it could be, it depends, whether or not it's racist depends on the angle and the purpose of the question, right? So by asking the question in the way it's been posed, we can look at it from a couple of different angles. If the criticism is directed at immigrants, it's 100% racist. If it's directed at the policy and the purpose, as Liban was talking about, why is Canada doing this? And is this altruistic? No, it's absolutely not. I read recently that the Canadian government, part of the economic recovery plan for the pandemic is to increase immigration. That doesn't sound to me like it's for the people who are coming here. It sounds to me like it's for Canada. And I think that in a lot of ways, successive Canadian governments have looked upon immigration in the same way that we collectively look at the resources of this country, as a place to mine, to extract, and to bring in labor and skills in the areas that we don't have. And because capitalism needs to feed itself, to increase population, to show that we're growing. And so if we critique the policy, I think that that's really productive. If we sit back and say, you know, I see too many of this person or that diaspora on a subway, or this isn't the nation that it used to be, then we're reverting back to Sir John A. Macdonald's words in Parliament when he said that he wanted to revert Canada to its Aryan roots. That's the country that Canada built or wanted to build, and that's why we see resistance at different levels, because I think in a lot of ways Canada does view itself as a white nation. And that looks beyond the people that have come here, like my wife's family, and it looks beyond or kind of ignores Indigenous presence. So that's how I've been approaching this question, is that there's sort of at least two angles to approach it from.
I love that for its brilliant clarity in terms of, are you critiquing the people or the policy? Let's critique the policy. Let's do that right now. Who would like to maybe discuss a policy when it comes to immigration that you're familiar with that is an example of structural racism, or, you know, already the word decolonization has been brought into the conversation a few times. Like I would love for anybody to, basically, if you have a bone you have to pick right now is the time. Talking about a specific policy as an example. Who would like to take this?
I mean, I can jump in on just experiences that I've either been witness to or I've heard of. We talk about, building community. We talk about, we can talk about this in anything. So when we hire, for example, someone from an equity group, and we just have one person of color at a table, that's tokenism, and we understand that system and how that's not going to help neither the employee nor the employer. But when we try to build community and create a sense of belonging, we need to bring in more people so that that one person is not isolated. And so what I find fascinating is when we do have new Canadians coming in, and the resistance for reunification of families occurs. So a new Canadian has arrived, has their PR papers, and is trying to, and the old term was sponsor somebody. I'm not sure that's still the term that we use, from the time of my parents in the 70s. We want to sponsor a cousin. We want to sponsor a brother or an uncle. And the experience was that it was always pushed back. Well, we don't want to sponsor anybody here unless there is a need for that person to be here. And that besoin, that need, what is that need? Is that based on, and that was one of the questions I heard earlier, is it based on the need of the host country or the need of the immigrant, right? And it's the need of the new Canadian also to build community and to build a sense of belonging. You don't bring people to a country, allow a couple in, and not create community. And I think that's one of the things that I've noticed as a child of immigrants, looking around me. Now I'm mid 40s, so it's been a while since I've had to have that experience. But in the 80s, when I was a kid, as my parents would try and talk to their MP and have discussions about why is it that this member of their family can't join them here. The dances and the tangos and the communication, this is before the internet was even alive, sitting down with your MP and trying to convince them to help you through. And now I know of, and actually there's a fantastic alum from St. Mary's who's doing her own consulting for immigration. Now we have these services to help to give new Canadians an opportunity to reunite families. But that's the part that boggles my mind so much, is as we create this need, and we talk about the numbers, particularly in Nova Scotia, we're very proud to say that people are not flying off to Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, but they're actually staying here and creating community. Are we actually facilitating that? Are we allowing for the reunification of families? Are we, I have a friend who, began a relationship with someone and had to, do all the proving of their conjugal relationship, spill the beans to the entire system to really justify why their legal husband could move to the country. And I don't know, at least 3 years before they were able to be together in a family unit. So I wonder about reunification policy of creating community, creating the sense of belonging, and how are we doing when it comes to that?
I find that to be so fascinating to look at this policy from a family lens, because as you say, communities are built with families, whatever configuration of a family you have, how we, we're human beings, as we know from the pandemic, we're social, we need each other. And it makes me think of, I've been thinking recently about the history of the head tax in Canada. It's a history that we all know. It was meant to extract the labor that Canada needed to build and not bring anybody else, i.e. wives and family, because that's how the community would grow. And I still see echoes, obviously, with our temporary foreign workers who pick our food, or the people who are our nannies who have their own children at home on the other side of the world, and these policies, even if there isn't a prime minister today in Parliament Hill who is saying, we want to keep this a white man's country, it really seems pretty similar from the family lens of keeping families apart. I wonder, Liban, because you have really interesting professional experience with working with young people, and specifically around jobs. And I think you said that some of the young people you work with, they are immigrants themselves and navigating the system. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen?
Yeah, I think if I can combine that question with the earlier question around a key policy that's a challenge, or that I have a personal gripe with, it's the foreign credential recognition, right? What, again, to echo the comment Carrie made earlier, immigration isn't altruism, right? We are creaming the best of the best from developing nations and bringing them here. The accountants, the lawyers, the medical professionals, the engineers, and then they arrive here, and we haven't created a fast enough process or an efficient enough process that allows them to actually practice in their area of work, right? And so that's really where some of these racist tropes then come in, right? It's the physicist who's a cab driver, right? Or the engineer who's now working at the local airport near the hotel near the airport. And so, all these folks are coming and they're taking our jobs, or they're not working, or this lazy immigrant trope. And the truth of the matter is, they're not, right? I mean, one of my favorite television shows is Kim's Convenience, right? That talks about the Korean immigrant experience here and how they started opening up these convenience stores. Many of them are, again, teachers, lawyers, engineers, but because their credentials weren't recognized, they ended up creating these sort of economic cooperatives where they created this convenience store network, right? And so, what is the consequence of not having human beings be able to fulfill their full potential, right? Is it because of protectionism? Is it because we think the education systems in India don't produce the same quality of healthcare workers as Ireland? The truth of the matter is, it's not fundamentally accurate. However, we're just more comfortable with having white doctors in this country than we are with those that are racialized, right? And that does affect the slowness of having individuals' credentials recognized. I know that we've been doing a much better job of that, or at least attempting to do a better job of that as of recent. But that is one key policy that I think has been an incredibly problematic one that's really stripped many individuals of what could have been significant potential. The other thing is that going back to immigration not being altruism here, about 40% of Canadian small and medium businesses in this country are having a really difficult time hiring new employees. For those of us that are sort of familiar with small to medium businesses, they produce about 70% of Canada's jobs, right? They are the engine of our economy. And if they're struggling to find employees, we need to think about what that means and why. And so that's one of the reasons, right? And that's because, our population's aging, baby boomers are retiring, our growth in the labor force is like almost at zero. Hence the reason why, as Karen mentioned, our federal government, over I think the next 3 to 5 years, is looking to take on unprecedented level of immigrants, almost 400,000 per year, right? So it's almost, I would say it's almost, karmic irony that, 10 years ago, when some of the administrations were here, we were shunning immigration, or maybe a little bit more resistant to it, and all of a sudden we're opening the doors, right? It's not because we've become less racist, it's because our economic attitudes and requirements have necessitated this more open door policy. And we'll see that swing, right? With automation requiring less and less labor, I think over the next 30 years, we'll see another shift where we become far more closed. And we need to be ready for that pendulum swing, right? And you'll see those attitudes around racism and why we don't want immigrants becoming less economic and more around maintaining the cultural and social fabrics of our country. And I just wanted to put that on the table because, right, what we see now today, I think, is a really contextual COVID economic related matter. But as more and more companies begin to think about pandemic proofing their supply chains, which means making it less resistant, less reliant on human capital, and more automated, I think this question of, is our immigration critiquing racist, is probably going to become more of a profound question than what we think it is today.
It makes me very nervous for the next election cycle, federally speaking, because, as you say, doors open and close, but racist attitudes don't change that quickly, Carrie, did you have anything to add about any policy that you'd like to take to task?
You mentioned the one that kind of came directly to mind when I was thinking about the temporary foreign workers policy and how that's like the most extreme example of just extracting labor, and it's almost contradictory to the idea of supporting the economy, because people come here and work and send all of their money back home to their family and just subsist while they're here. And I think that it's the most cynical version, right? Because there's no opportunity for family to come. There's maybe potentially down the road an opportunity for the person to stay, but what life is that? And so just echoing what Rohini brought up about family and about reunification. I think that that any policy that has some long-term health impact for our society, not just our economy, because we get focused on that, right? But what is life if we don't have strong, happy, healthy relationships with each other, if we don't have our cultures? And really, I guess I go there because of the way colonial policy sort of targeted Indigenous culture, but by breaking apart families in that way, it has the same effect, right? It's reducing cultural presence, and Canada markets itself globally as this tolerant society, multicultural society. But when it comes right down to it, and you look at the things that we chose during this pandemic to allow, and the things that we chose to lock down, and there's a pretty clear slant, at least here in British Columbia, towards things that we would consider white, right? Not the cultural holidays and celebrations. There was no accommodations made for those. We would wait till after Easter. We would wait till after the different celebrations that are Christian, right? That have a white or Eastern or a European, they're rooted in Europe, and we would make all kinds of accommodations for that. But when it comes to other things, they were so fast to shut them down. And I think that I'm not saying we shouldn't have. I'm saying we should have shut them all down, right? That's my position on it. But there was so much resistance to restricting religious freedom. But religion is a culture, and there was no second thought given to restricting cultural freedom.
Yeah, there has been so much inequity and racism involved in terms of COVID. Well, just COVID. I'll just end the sentence there. I'm aware that all of you do work with young people. And I'm wondering, I know that in order to be informed about these types of conversations, you really need to know your past, you need to know your history, but how do you feel about how these conversations are happening among young people? Rohini, you're nodding.
Yeah, I mean, it's the heart and soul of St. Mary's, our students. And I have a privilege of having conversations when we were on campus a bit more. Students would come in to talk about academics and then take a moment, and I knew they wanted to talk about other things, which was exactly what we're talking about, what Carrie was talking about, that connection, that wanting to, can someone hear my story? And, one of the big things is students, international students invest a lot of time and sacrifice to come to another country, sometimes oceans away, and want to know that their investment has been worthwhile for themselves or for their families. And a lot of them do want to stay in the Maritimes, and we're glad to see that. And we've put, and when I say we, I say government, I say other support systems for university students are in place and actively engaging with students. But sometimes things don't work out as well. And students are worried about getting a job in their field. And I happen to be in the arts and humanities. And I'll just say, go out and do a good arts degree. Come on, you want to be interculturally competent. You want to be, come on, the best leaders in the world have humanities background. They're sort of looking at me going, but what am I going to do with that job? How am I going to get a job? What am I going to do? The incredible stress and worry I see is hard to manage for many of us who are on the other side of it and wanting to counsel and guide them and let them be dreamers and let them be creative contributors to society, and for them to stay and become Canadians. Just the PR process to get permanent residency is incredible. And I know Liban would know much more about this than I would. Everything from when they graduate, when that graduation letter comes out. Right now, I'm setting up funding, helping to get funding letters out to international students. And I want to make sure that we're giving them enough funding so that they can actually finish their degree and then want to stay and not have a terrible experience. We're using the funding model to give a little bit more to the international students and not to the domestics. Oh, is that a right thing to do? Yes, that's what equity is about. So we want to ensure that those international students feel that they have got a little bit of extra landing pad as they make this big leap to come to St. Mary's. And we want them to eventually stay. We want them to go on and do more graduate work. We want them to become part of our community. And so if we don't do some of those, make some of those financial contributions to them, that's really important. I think that, many of us who are engaged with students sit and listen. We try and increase the mental health accessibility to many of our students. And for international students, that can be challenging. I self-identify immediately upon my first class. That has been something that I've been doing recently. And I find that students, once they see that a professor has self-identified, they actually are able to do the same. And with that comes story, with that comes background, with that comes perhaps seeing how they belong in academia. And of course, I am interested in seeing students continue on in a scholarly way. And that's my bias always. But that's not the road for everyone. And I'm delighted when a student of South Asian descent, someone from Bangladesh or a Punjabi, whomever from Nepal, might approach me and say, you might understand this, but I have something to say about my experience so far. Can you give me some context? And that's a great privilege that I have. And I feel that because I self-identify, students feel like they can be themselves. And I'm certainly not saying that my colleagues who do not fall in equity groups are not wonderful professors, and of course they are, but I'm just able to share my lived experience. And it can be everything from academics to personal relationships to communicating with their dad, declaring a major, anything. And I'm really happy that I'm able to do that. But beyond those conversations, financial stability is huge for our students. And we need to show them that we are invested in them. And that sometimes comes in dollars.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to remind the audience that we are taking audience Q&A. So I hear that some of you have your hands up, which means that you have things you want to say, which is great. So at the top of the hour, so that's 5 minutes from now, you can chat them into the chat. That's when it'll open up, and we will pose as many questions as we can to the panelists. Just before we get there, I want to ask Liban about the conversations you're hearing from young people. Do you feel that they're equipped to be having knowledgeable conversations about race and immigration and policy? I mean, what are you hearing?
Yeah, I think what's really, really evident, especially with young people who are 25 and younger, who grown up with the internet as a lifeline and a communication tool, they're, as much as NIMBYism has become a thing in our country, there's really a global view that they also have. They're also recognizing, that the burger that they eat at the kitchen table has consequences in terms of the environment halfway across the world. So I think there's just a greater sense of, if you will, wokeness, right, among this population, and beyond wokeness, it's a certain level of, I think, sophistication and understanding the interconnectedness, right, given our global economic systems. And so I think they're better locating themselves there, especially in places like Canada. They're beginning to also recognize, some of the truths that, the hard truths that they're facing, that, that this generation might be worse off than their grandparents and their parents, right? Which is something that we haven't really seen. The trend since industrialization has been that each generation becomes successively, better off. that's not true any longer, right? The trends demonstrate incomes are lower, housing ownership is lower, work satisfaction, all of these things are trending negatively downward. And I think there's just that recognition that that even if they're not making the direct connection to immigration, the economic benefits of a smart, effective, cogent economic system that imbues good immigration policy will result in their benefit. Again, it is an economic exchange. As I mentioned earlier, 40% of our workforce needs are being unmet. We need immigrants to be here, not only to be employed, but to really start those businesses that create those job opportunities that we're currently seeing unavailable for folks. And so it's difficult to run a business if you don't have anybody working for you, right? So as much as I mentioned earlier that our economic system is driven by entrepreneurs, if you don't have people to work at your business as you're starting, those businesses don't actually succeed. So I think there will be, if not already there, this rising consciousness around the intrinsic connection between young people here and young people in other countries, and the shared economic opportunities between them that can be hemmed through a good, smart immigration policy. I'm not looking to sort of be really pithy in that explanation. I genuinely believe that I think more and more folks are just going to recognize that the international lens that we're going to have to take to our local for our local benefits.
Carrie, did you have anything to add about the kinds of conversations that you hear among your students?
In one of my classes, I teach an art and social practice class, and I have a lot of foreign students in that class, and we start with conversations around Indigenous artists and how they use their art to resist colonialism, to resist capitalism, to defend the land. And so, and then I ask them to make work about something that's important to them. And sometimes they make work about where they're from, and for people from where they're from. And I love it when that happens, because I know that I'm not creating a barrier for them to be who they are. I'm inviting their culture into my classroom, into this country, into the world of art. But also sometimes the artwork becomes a critique, or confronts the things that they thought about Canada, because we're learning and talking together about what reconciliation means, what decolonization means. And for me, it means transformation of relationship. It means transformation of relationship between people and land. And so I think that that's kind of like my final thought around this question, and maybe a suggestion for policy. I know that that there's finally some Indigenous presence in the test to come here, right? But I don't think that it's enough, because when people immigrate to Canada, they're not just immigrating to this country. They're immigrating to the 600 plus First Nations that pre-exist Canada. And I think that if we're charting a course forward that welcomes people here in a more equitable way, then that question of land and our relationship with it, and the complications of the way that Canada looks upon it as a resource, in the same way that they look upon immigrants as resource, need to be confronted and need to be dismantled, right? I mean, we really do have to transform that. And I think that, I mean, it's my primary interest for being here, to bring some Indigenous presence and thought to it. And when we think about immigration in the context of reconciliation, which I think is possible, And it needs to be, we collectively need to through that transformation of the way we think about the land and the way we welcome people here, I think that we could become the country that we tell the world we are.
I find that so powerful, the idea of transformation. And when you're talking about the way we see the land and the way we see people and the extractive, methods and comparing them. And this is why I love having these conversations, is to constantly get my worldview tweaked a bit and to be adding and to keep my mind open, it brings me to my last question for you. It's such a quickie because it's already 2:02. And before we get into audience questions, I just want to say that, a lot of people here who are listening to you may think, wow, these guys are so learned. That's why they can talk about this stuff. A lot of people are afraid to talk about race in their own lives, or immigration is like a hot topic. I can't talk about it. Very quickly, do you have just one piece of advice on how to approach these conversations sensitively, whether it's with your own family or friends or colleagues? Rohini, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, it's the question, where do you come from, right? And when do you become local? So how long does it take to become local? So, probably 10 years ago in my 30s, I was always like, oh, I don't know how to answer that question. And I was quick to justify my presence. And now when I'm asked that question, people have to sit and go through a lecture of reconciliation, so that I'm on unceded territory, that Canada is built on settlers, and that immigrants have to navigate that term. And I know that now I have children, and I have to have that same conversation and see their reaction as they are asked where they come from, and to see how they do a much better job than I did when I was their age.
Liban, you next.
So I became a Canadian citizen. I think it was maybe in the 3rd grade. And it was probably one of the most disappointing experiences of my life because it made me miss a pizza lunch. I had no idea. I was told to dress up. It was the first time I wore a tie. I was in a room. I was told not to speak. And all I could think about is all my friends are having pizza lunch back home in school, right? In other words, I had literally no conception of what it meant, the privilege that was conferred upon me with this receipt of citizenship. And so I think being cognizant of what it means, the privilege, and more importantly, the responsibility to have those discussions is something that I think is important for us to engage in. It should be an ongoing discourse for us. And it should be one where we try to demystify again what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to remove things like illegal immigrant, because I don't think anyone is illegal, right? What it means to live in a nation that has a significant amount of the world's fresh water, right? And thinking about what that ownership, that idea of like private ownership looks like. I think it's incredibly important to think about the relationship and the responsibility from a global standpoint between those nations that have these resources at a time of global significant global and climate change, and for making sure that we give equitable access to those, we give access to those resources for those who need it. I think these are important conversations we need to have. And how do you do that? I think it starts at the lunch table where those pizza lunches are occurring. It happens at the dinner table. And it also happens when we hear, excuse my language, BS wedge issues come up in our politics. We need to challenge our leaders to also, step up and ensure that they're not having divisive conversations when we speak about immigration, but one that's more unified and one that provides a greater lens and appreciation for this topic. So I think those are some of the ways that to do it. So I would say cognizant of what it means and what our roles are in terms of driving these discourses, so that they're not simply one-off webinars, but continual conversations that are occurring in all of our spaces.
And Carrie, a brief bit of advice on how to have these conversations.
I would say always start with the recognition that this country was built on immigration. Unless you are First Nations, then you are descendant at the very least from immigrants. And by positioning yourself there, then you place yourself in the middle of the conversation. And in the same way that I talk about being both First Nations and settler, I take ownership of the privilege that comes with that settler side, right? And I think if you start there and include in your thinking and in your conversation that much of this country is unceded territory, that this is Indigenous land, and take to heart those territorial acknowledgements that we make, and let them become part of what guides the decisions that we make together. I think if you connect those parts when you enter into these conversations, then it becomes productive, and it reverses from pointing outwards and it goes inside, because you're placing yourself in the middle of it and recognizing that you complicate it, right? That you're complicit. And that's what that'd be my advice for how to enter these conversations.
Hannah,
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry to jump in.
Yeah.
I just saw a comment by Leslie Harper, if I'm correct. Leslie, you're absolutely right. I should have been cognizant as I talked about the immigrant experience.
Could we just mention what her question is in case?
Right, sorry. Yeah,
so go ahead.
Leslie talked about the fact that people of African descent have been in Canada prior to its the actual existence of Canada as a state, and thinking about the history, location, and grounding about people of African descent in this country. So as we talk about Europe immigration, not only focusing on European immigrants or early settlers. So I just want to acknowledge that that's absolutely true. And when we take that lens, it removes particularly people of African descent, not as being recent newcomers, but people who have been here and contributing to this country before it was a country. So I just wanted to acknowledge and say that that was a complete and utter absence on my part, and I should have acknowledged that. And so I just wanted to.
Yes, no, well, thank you to Leslie for the question, because that is what we're grappling with in the conversation, right, on a larger level, is dismantling the white supremacist European colonial lens on what it means to be in Canada and be living the Canadian experience. So that was great, because we jumped into the questions that are coming from the audience. There are many. I'm going to read one from Uzima, and I'm just going to throw this to Rohini, or if somebody else wants to jump in. How do we begin to change these inherently flawed systems and accurately address systemic racism in immigration? That's a big question.
That's a great question. Education, education, education. I don't really know what else except get into the classroom, read, interact with community members, ask yourself the hard questions, look at your own implicit bias. I struggle every day with my own bias. Oh, but you're a racialized woman, you should be rock on. No, I'm not. I have bias. I live actually very close to what was the former Africville of Halifax, one of the oldest communities of African heritage. And I every week need to remind myself of how privileged I am to be living here and what I don't know. And so I'm a constant student. And so for me, the answer to that question is education. Of course, I'm in a privileged situation and I have access to education. I work in an educational system. And so breaking barriers of privilege is important as well. But that if you have the drive to break systems, it really very much comes from within, and education, I think, is the key.
Keeping on the topic of education, we have a question from John, and anybody who wants to jump in can take it. How do we get provincial education departments to update their curricula? And I think we all have this common experience of growing up in the Canadian educational system and not getting all the stuff that we needed, right? Who wants to jump in with that one?
I can speak a little bit about what I've observed in the attempts to integrate Indigenous content into provincial curriculum. And it always seems to take a big push. I mean, it almost has to be the public have to demand it. My wife is a teacher. I hear the conversations that she has amongst teachers, but as much as they may want to, and as much as many of the individuals may do so, the way to implement change, and I think we're seeing what can happen when a government decides that they want to roll things backwards in Alberta right now when it comes to provincial curriculum. We have to demand it. Like, we collectively stand up and say, this needs to happen. And not just a particular point of view, sort of to Rohini's point of education. It has to be about critical thinking, right? That education can't just be, here's a bunch of facts, because culture is fluid, things change. It has to be, how do we examine these things through different lenses that complicate them? How do we have, but back to your question, what advice would you give? How do we have these complicated conversations without turning them into polarized fights? And so teaching critical thought or encouraging critical thought is incredibly important when it comes to what the content of that curriculum is.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I feel like you wanted to.
Yeah, I think there's two things that I want to talk about, something that should be subtracted from the curriculum, something that should be added to the curriculum. I'll talk about what should be subtracted. I think it's important for us to investigate, how populations move and migrate, but including this idea that Indigenous communities are migrants to this land is something that we should be very, very mindful of, because it's really an insidious attempt to position Indigenous communities as being, just one of many people who've been migrating through here, and so they don't have a claim or ownership of the land, right? And I think that has a very, very sort of, it's again, it's an insidious attempt to sort of, to erase that history. And so I think that's one interesting thing for us just to be mindful of. The other piece is, I remember taking woodshop in class, but I don't ever remember learning about any of the treaties in this country, right? And I think that's something we should absolutely be looking to learn about. I see no reason why we're not learning about treaty agreements and the relationship between Indigenous people and settlers on this land from as early as grade 3, 4, and 5, right? And if we're gonna learn about, quote unquote, the discovery of Canada and North America, we should certainly be learning about those who have been its land protectors, for millennia. So again, that's something we should, I think, subtract, and something that we should be thinking about adding. I think that's one of the ways we begin to really appreciate the immigration conversation, by making sure it's rooted in our relationship with the Indigenous peoples and this land.
I love that reminder, because, speaking from personal experience, my children are at home right now. They're not really doing class so much. And I feel a personal sense of responsibility of wanting to teach them about treaties. I do sense that there's change in the educational system. Generally speaking, this morning I saw their morning announcements over Zoom, because that's how we do them now. And O Canada on their morning announcements is, it was a Cree version in Ojibwe. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? That's very different from when I was in school. And then it opened my mind to the thought of decolonization, because it was the national anthem. So I'm always a student. I'm always thinking, as Rohini suggested that we do. Thank you so much to the panel for making the time, for bringing the richness of conversation to this. Thank you to the audience for being here. I hope that you feel more confident going out in the world and having these conversations on your own as well. I think I might be the person who's closing the conversation. I don't know if Marie is coming back or Mohammed, but if it is indeed me just saying goodbye, I want to say take care of yourselves and I hope you stay well. Thank you so much.
No,
for
no,
being here.
we're gonna jump in. We're gonna jump in.
We're jumping
Okay.
in, man.
No, we have to thank you all. I mean, that was, my goodness, my mind is going in 10,000 directions. Marie, what did you think?
Listen, it was all amazing, and I was writing notes, and it was exactly what I'd hoped in terms of the richness of the conversation. But I have to tell you that, I mean, the pieces about family and having more people around that themed through everybody's conversations. But the moment when I sat up and had a lightning bolt, it was your fault, Carrie, and it was, we could become the country we tell the world we are. I got a text from some of my colleagues in that moment as well. And I think that is on so many levels, the aspiration we need to have and the true north that keeps us going and getting better. And you've given us so many tools to do that and food for thought. And so thank you. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. And of course, to Hannah, to herd the cats and weave it together as she does so beautifully. So merci beaucoup to everybody. And back to you, Mohammed, for the final word.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. That comment was a defining point, because there is a real tension. Let's be honest here, right? We claim we want to be a country that is inviting. We that's the story we tell of ourselves. But to a certain degree, we also like who we are, and we don't necessarily always want to change. There is a bit of NIMBYism in every single one of us. Like even amongst newcomers, like I know I've met people who've been here for 30, 40 years, and they're like, look, man, I struggled when I got here. Why can't these new folks just figure it out? They like, it's like there is a tension, and that tension is the central core of what I think is like the question we're asking today is not about, can we criticize, is criticizing immigration racist? The real question we asked was, are we a society that will perpetually accept and want to be one that evolves, where we're building more patches to the quilt, where we're creating like an identity that is mixed with all these different new things that are coming? Do we want that, or do we not? Because I think that if we don't, then like that says something about us. But that's not the story that we tell of ourselves. And the one thing that I just, when Carrie said that, and this was brought up a number of times, like today, like the province of Ontario said 4,227 people were infected with COVID yesterday. When you look at the map of who is getting infected, it is, at least in the GTA, it's all in newcomer communities. Not all, but it's most heavily in newcomer communities. These are the people who are these aren't irresponsible people that are like, these are the people who are essential workers and are putting their lives on the line for all of us to subsist here. And I think that when we think about the central question of who we are, we need to appreciate who we are becoming by acknowledging who we're bringing in and their sacrifices. And I totally agree with Carrie about it begins with not accepting this quilt where we have a Métis patch or an Inuit patch or whatnot. The entire quilt is built upon Indigenous land. And if we don't figure out our relationship with the owners of the quilt, the ones who have built this, like given the thread for this quilt to be made, then we will always be the ones who look at the newcomers with suspicion, because we will be not the people who accept, but the people who look to other. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. It was a pleasure, and hopefully we'll have this conversation again. Have a good day.